Well, thank you very much. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, and delighted to be interviewing Roger, who, as George said, great sage, great writer, great thinker, and one of our great philosophers. The first question I had, Roger, is a mundane question about politics. Did you read either the Tory manifesto or the Labour manifesto at the last election?
No. I have better things to do.
I thought that might be the answer, but what did you make of what the parties were offering, of the two alternative visions?
Well, neither of them were particularly full of vision, as I saw it. It was they were both improvised around essentially the emergency created by Brexit. How were they to compete with each other in the big task of leading the country forward to the execution of a decision that neither of them had anticipated? And so they were both of them improvising. Of course, there is a difference between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn in that Jeremy Corbyn clearly has a philosophy, a very out-of-date and really, in my view, quite menacing philosophy, but it's a real one, whereas Theresa May clearly sticks to the old Tory tradition of avoiding thought at all costs and hoping to get through from moment to moment.
Indeed. But it must be astonishing to you, surely, to see, after everything that's happened in the last 30, 40 years, that Marxist philosophy resurface and gain support among large numbers of people.
Yes.
In Britain who you might, even 5, 10 years ago, thought it unlikely would ever vote for that analysis.
Yes, I think that's true. It is surprising, but I think there are two factors that to some extent explain the resurgence, at least among young people, of a kind of Marxist way of thinking. The first is the collapse of the education system. People don't know any history. Most people of the younger generation really have great difficulty in conceiving what the Russian Revolution was about or what its consequences were for not only for the Russian people but for the rest of the world. And that I think is a serious problem. But the other problem is that you can reshape the Marxist philosophy but as not an economic or a historical doctrine, but as a kind of call for equality. And the reasons for being suspicious of equality are much harder to express than the reasons for being in favour of it. And once you, even though they are much better reasons. So once you've fixed your flag to the banner of equality, then you're in a leading position, especially with young people who are the younger generation who feel that the world has been confiscated from them anyway by these baby boomers who've had it so good and taken all the resources that they themselves need.
So do you feel that sense that younger voters, by which I mean if you look at the demographics and the polling, we must really think of as anyone below the age of 45, that they are right in feeling that something has been stolen from them, that there is a racket operated against them?
Well, yes, it wasn't a deliberate act of theft, but of course we post-war baby boomers, we enjoyed things that had never been enjoyed before, that the National Health Service, the completely free and really quite efficient forms of education at the bottom level. And it enabled us to spend all our money on property and building up our own little empires. And of course, they find themselves, the younger generation, in a completely new situation. We have pushed up the value of land and lodging to the point that they can't afford it. We've also, through our own neglect, allowed the education system to decline completely, having enjoyed it. And we've left them with a sense that, that the cream has been taken off everything.
But was there, you've written brilliantly about community, belonging, sense of obligation to future generations, previous generations. Is there also a sense in which that post-45 settlement of the welfare state became, if you like, a secular religion, and that it did bind people together? And if people feel that that settlement has disintegrated and they can't afford a house either, they're in the market then for something which might even just be as whimsical as just blowing up the system in the hope that something else will emerge.
Well, that might be the case. I don't think the British people are quite as desolate as that. Well, I mean, we just heard from Mr. Holroyd about the concept of the citizen as the French understand it, and I think we ought to address that question of what we put in the place of the idea of the citizen. The French have a clear idea of what citizenship is. It was defined for them at the French Revolution as a contract between le citoyen et l'État. You know, that there are two sides to it. This gives the state a hugely important role to play, because that's the other half of your relationship of belonging. And it gives the idea of a citizen a kind of titular presence in all political processes. It became a title of dignity after the French Revolution, satirized by Flaubert in L'Éducation sentimentale. You call someone citoyen by the time of Flaubert by way of ridiculing him, but nevertheless, it has retained its sense of being at the heart of one's relation to one's surrounding political order. We in Britain don't have that legal idea of citizenship. Legally speaking, we are subjects of the Queen. We can't define what that means very easily. There's no social contract which tells us what the Queen's duties are and what our duties are. But it comes about, this relationship between the Queen and you, by the fact that you live here. That this is your place of belonging. So we define our fundamental loyalties not in these quasi-legal terms, but in terms of our belonging to a place. And that's what has been put in question, of course, so not just by the post-1945 settlement, but by the mass immigration that came about from the 60s onwards, and by our membership of the European Union, which has turned upside down our sense of where legal authority comes from. So the Brexit vote surprised everybody because it was the expression of a residual sense that we are not citizens, that we belong to a country, that country is ours, and we define ourselves in terms of it, and that somehow this form of self-definition had been confiscated from us. David Goodhart, who's here, I'm glad to say, writes very movingly about the distinction between the somewheres and the anywheres, the people for whom their social identity is a form of belonging to a place and the networks that grow in that place, and those who can move more freely about a globalized world, among whom Alexander Holroyd is a quintessential example. He's even citizen of two countries. Or rather, he's a citizen of France and a subject of the Queen. And this is a remarkable achievement. But it's not one that can be offered in a general way to the ordinary working class person of this country or the ordinary farmer of this country. And the great problem that has come to the fore, not just through mass migration and so on, but also through the Brexit vote and everything else, is what is the form of belonging that can unite these different networks of obligation that David has distinguished, the anywhere and the somewhere. And we have to unite them, and that's one of the questions that we have to address.
How do you feel about it in terms of nationhood? And you used the term Britain and English, so I'm Scottish and British. That's another layer of complexity and a huge change in the last 20 or 30 years.
Absolutely. I would say layers of complexity are in the nature of the case when it comes to one's relations of belonging. You know, I belong to my family, to my village, to my county, to England, to the United Kingdom, and so on. It isn't in itself something either to lament or to think of as a source of confusion. You know, we can describe our country as 3.5 nations joined together under a common sovereignty, or as one single nation state with 3.5 bits to it. You know, it doesn't. These are. We're not dealing with absolute definitions. It's not a mathematical question that we're trying to answer. It's a if you like, an emotional question. To whom do I belong? To whom do I owe allegiance? And I think we've suffered greatly because the European Union inherited an idea of allegiance from the French Revolution, essentially, the idea of citizenship defined in terms of rights. So the European courts, the ECJ and the European Court of Human Rights, try to replace all relations of obligation with ideas of human right, of the rights of the citizen. And we were brought up in a completely different way by the common law of England to recognise that our fundamental condition of belonging is a relation of duty. That's what sovereignty is. It's your duty towards the sovereign and towards all the people who, like you, are subjects of that sovereign. And we have suffered a lot because the concept of duty has been gradually expelled from our ways of social thinking and replaced by the idea of the individual right, so that people are constantly claiming their rights without wishing to pay the true cost of them, which is their duty.
So you said it had been expelled. How can it be brought back post-Brexit?
Well, one beginning is to be honest about it and to recognise that, you know, that we are in a crisis, that we do have the fundamental obligation to define what it is that we all belong to define that first person plural that includes not only you and me, but all the people in this room and all the people whom we depend upon, all the strangers who cater for us and so on. And that means becoming a little bit clearer than we've been willing to be about what it is to be British. And that means, you know, affirming the idea that we define our loyalty in terms of our duty towards a place, the place where we belong, and that newcomers into this situation don't come into this situation in order to take advantage of it and to perpetuate the old form of belonging that they have left. They come to enjoy the new form of belonging that they're coming to. That means not just having rights, but having duties. And this is when we go back to the problem that George just raised with Alexander Holroyd about, you know, the shock that he felt that 5 young people identified as British wanted to blow up themselves and all around them on the tube. He was right to be shocked. I've been shocked by this too. It's happened before that episode. You know, that people described as British because they had no other collective identity could nevertheless regard themselves as the dedicated enemies of Britain as an entity.
But if a leading Corbynista was here, or or Seamus Milne, or Schneider, or any of that crowd, and particularly McDonnell, they would, whether or not they would admit it is a different question, but they would articulate a politics in which they're very much committed to an idea that is transnational.
Yes.
One of the reasons they look to Venezuela or they look to Putin, and that's the root of the Marxist analysis, that it's beyond nation, beyond belonging, other than belonging to a political idea. Now, that is the fastest growing political movement in this country. It scored 40% of the vote,
yes,
and rising, and is hoovering up votes across the UK. So his alternative analysis is winning, isn't it?
Well, that's what I assume that we're here to rectify. That, of course, it is true that you can easily propose one of these transnational fantasies in the place of national loyalty and say, no, we have a better solution. This is what, of course, the French Revolution did and what the Russian Revolution did. Both of them leading to immediately to mass genocide. But of course, we assume that Jeremy Corbyn's entourage are not yet in the business of genocide. But it is the case.
Well, let's see. But
yeah.
I mean,
it is the case, though, that their language identifies their transnational loyalty in a way that excludes at least 60% of the population of this country. We are not, for them, people to whom one has to recognize any obligation or any accountability. I see national loyalty as the sine qua non of democratic government. It's because I share my loyalty to this country with my neighbour who votes Labour that I accept a Labour government. I recognise that we all owe the same duty to the government that comprehends us because we belong to the same thing.
But that's what's so interesting about the rise of the hard left and its very successful takeover of the Labour Party. In the politics of old, we all accepted, or Harold Wilson and Ted Heath or Margaret Thatcher accepted the rules of the game, respected British institutions. I mean,
yes.
the Corbynistas really don't. And I find it baffling, and you're talking about history, and people are, partly because of the education system, might not remember the details of the Russian Revolution, but quite a lot of this is happening now in Venezuela. So it's not even as though the present seems to make any difference.
But what I would say, you've raised a really difficult issue, which I have no clear answer to. But what I would say is that every form of loyalty is accompanied by a form of resentment. Resentment towards the thing which demands your obedience. So that, and politics consists in partly playing on these two against each other. There will wherever there's a loyalty, there will be the resentment of those people who feel either excluded from it or not sufficiently acknowledged by it. And left-wing politics has always, in every time, depended upon recruiting this resentment. It's a negative thing, and you can tell this from the language used, the Tory scum sort of thing. I was brought up in a left-wing household, and my father was a Labour supporter and a trade unionist, and he could not describe somebody who voted Conservative or who had any Conservative identity as though he were human. These are people who are outside the reach of my compassion, was his basic position. And because he had felt that resentment and he'd given his life to it. And it was observing the unhappiness of this man, my father, that made me into a Conservative.
Now, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, so we're going to take some questions. But it is that point, it's the Orwell point about how the left, the hard left, has to other people and has to exclude, and then that is the route to making people enemies of the revolution, which point they can be dealt with in all sorts of ways. First question here in the second row, please.
It was just really around the question of loyalty to, I think it's really interesting what you said about people feeling a duty to the Queen, and but I think the stuff to do with the sort of left-wing militants is really being affected by collective social mood and sort of that disgruntledness that people are feeling. So I would say that your point is right about we all feel, subjects of this country and a loyalty to it, and it doesn't matter, we'll accept a Labour or a Conservative government, but currently the hard left are picking up on and taking popularity from collective social mood.
They're also doing something. If you haven't seen it yet, Olivia Utley, who's here somewhere on Reaction, wrote a brilliant piece about the latest Momentum video, which you should watch. And I find myself very much tuned into that stuff now. And it is outside the mainstream media, shared tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. The cleverness of it is that it is class war but it's without the sort of class war imagery of the 1980s. It is beautifully filmed and organised by people in the advertising industry in London. But sorry, Roger.
Well, yes, all I can say is I agree with what the young lady has said. But of course, one should recognise that there's been a huge change over the last 10 years with the growth of social media. I'm not on social media myself, but my children are. But one thing that is very striking about the social media is the ease with which anonymous anger can be spread across it. And it's a kind of seething morass of hatred and inadequacy, which one should turn one's mind away from. But of course...
you don't follow me on Twitter, do you?
No. But people fall into this, and it's a lamentable fact that the holder of the most powerful office in the world governs the country by Twitter. You know, but there we are. So this is a new situation we all have to learn to deal with, and I'm not sure that my method, which is to ignore it, is the right one.
Yes, and it's working for Trump. I'm going to ask a question from David Goodhart here.
Very quickly, you very kindly mentioned my book, Roger, and my Anywhere, Somewhere distinction. I mean, I rather failed to come up with any strong political arguments for how one can unite these two great value groups that in some ways divide our society, but it seems to be the central task of politics. Do you have any good ideas? And a brief little addendum. Do you think that in retrospect, the Theresa May comments about citizens of the world being citizens of nowhere was possibly a kind of almost somewhere triumphalism and perhaps a political mistake?
On the second point, yes, it was one of a seemingly unstoppable series of mistakes. Just about every one that could conceivably be made was made. But I agree with you. It's the business of social reconciliation is huge and complex. What Napoleon achieved in France was utterly amazing. In order to do it, he had to export the revolution, causing 2 million deaths elsewhere, and also destruction of the French army. But nevertheless, he did it. I hope it doesn't require quite that kind of effort. But one way of reconciling people's differences is to export their differences. It's the same with there's a second law of thermodynamics, which says that entropy can be overcome if exported. But I don't. And of course, wars do that. The Second World War completely overcame class conflict in our country by uniting the classes together, and the First World War did something similar. And in particular, in the First World War, of course, the officer class suffered much more than the men. They were the first to die in the trenches, and that caused a certain respect to arise once again for the privileged members of society. But I hope that we don't have to do things that way. But I've always had some hope myself in the pacifying influence of art, religion, and culture. Religion unfortunately, is part of the cause of our current problem because it's the wrong one that is on the up. But our culture, nevertheless, if you look at TV soaps and so on, there is always a tendency towards reconciliation as the ultimate goal. You know, settlement in a place like EastEnders and Steptoe and Son and so on. So that it's not a hopeless situation. But it does depend upon people becoming a bit more conscious of it than they are. And I'm very grateful for your book because it has made people conscious of it. So well done.
Question here from George.
So I'm flattered to be following after David, but I have noticed that a sign of being an anywhere person was people clutching his book, wondering about where they came from. And that led me to think that actually, really, we're all slightly hybrid in our nature, that we all have degrees of being anywhere people. We're, as a nation, we travel a lot. We have our influence spread around the world from one time or another. We're a great trading nation. And I felt that really that rests on very strong institutions and a sense of place. And I feel that it's a slightly false conflict, actually, to be anywhere or somewhere. And I just wondered what you think of that.
No, I agree with you that, of course, these aren't in total opposition or confrontation to each other. It's possible to be completely at home in Britain, even though a cosmopolitan person, as I am. If you look about, I think one very interesting example, apart from the British Empire as such, is the example of the novelist George Eliot, who wrote the most beautiful of all our accounts that we have of what it is to be at home in England, Middlemarch and Silas Marner and all those. She was completely devoted to the idea of making this somewhere into the moral heart of our country. But she herself was a great lover of German philosophy and German art, wanted to bring across all the romantic achievements of the German thinkers to our country, which she thought of as totally benighted. And her husband, of course, was the great expert on Goethe. They were totally anywhere people. But nevertheless, the thing that interested her was this country and the love that she felt for it, and that she felt was being engendered in it by its natural forms of community. And so I think, I guess I'm the same, only not at her intellectual level.
Some people would contest that. And I think we're out of time, but what a wonderful, wonderfully redemptive, uplifting note on which to end. And I think various people are waving at me that the next sessions are about to start. But can I ask you all to thank Roger? Absolutely fascinating. Thank you.